everybody. Welcome to Let's Hit It, brothers.
Just
Us
A squirrel looking
for
for
a nut,
not
trying
trying
to
to
get out
out
of
this rut.
this rut.
this rut.
All right. So, considering the fact that this is the first time you were on the read through, Brian Goldsack and Chris Sykes, you all did a fantastic job. Oleg is in the backdrop, helping us out briefly, getting started. Oleg, as always, thank you for everything. But Oleg isn't going to be able to join us tonight due to some things going on. So, your homeboy Scott Mason is here in the house with our two new regular guest hosts, Brian Goldsack and Chris Sykes. Brian and Chris, we are so thrilled to have you as part of the Squirrels team, and we know you are going to kill it tonight as well as every month when you come back in the future. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you who don't know Chris or Brian, well, you're going to get to know them tonight, and we're going to be talking about them a lot more later in the evening. Melody, greetings. It is so good to see you. Thank you for joining us as always. And be sure to chime in and give us your remarks and just be part of the conversation as you always very much are. Now, let's get... And Jessica is here too. Jessica, welcome to the show. We want to hear everything that you have to say. It is good to have both of y'all in the room. We know folks will also join too. And for those of you who watch regularly, listen, whether it is on the Post Facto YouTube channel or on Facebook Live or on Facebook, the post to sort of hang around after the fact, or on our Facebook page or on any other platform, who are just watching and don't say anything. We know that you're there. We have heard from you via DMs or other things that you sent, and we're grateful to have you as part of the crew. The topic tonight, I'll start with a story. So, when I worked for the city of New York, I will say a challenge that I have, or that I had, God, I'm thinking like I'm still working there, would be that I would be in large institutional settings and meetings that often had a political bent or were of policy nature. And sometimes the policies were made and then dictated down. You all are implementing them. Sometimes a general broad policy was out there, and what it would look like would be, and how it would be finessed into a complete policy was a matter of the discussion that I and other people would be in. Other times, we would be discussing some sort of policy that was in the process of formation. The government wanted to do the right thing, but needed inputs as to why. And one of the most scariest and most dangerous things that could happen under some circumstances were when voices weren't heard. Under one particular mayor, I won't say who, it was well known that if you said the wrong thing during a meeting at City Hall, you would be banished. You'd suddenly be disinvited from every meeting. Your voice wasn't heard. And yet, for those who cared about public policy, for those who wanted to make sure that the actions of the government or the laws that were being put into place really positively impacted the public as a whole, that was not only a personally debilitating thing, but it was a scary thing too. Sadly, many of the people who a lot of times were technocrats who had voices that really needed to be heard, though, didn't know how to make sure that their voices were heard. We'd be in meetings and they'd start to ramble on, or they would go into hyper-technical detail using a lot of jargon, and no one, including me, who was usually there to interpret this stuff, could understand what was being said. Or they would argue and not know when to stop. So one thing that I wish I could have offered some of those people was a class on how to have your voice heard. That's one setting. But I would like Melody, Jessica, anyone else watching or listening, as well as Brian and Chris, to talk to me a little bit about if they think there is ever a right time for someone to not have their voice heard. Chris or Brian, talk.
So this is good. This is a good topic, Scott. Sure, I think there are some circumstances where your voice not shouldn't be heard, but perhaps you shouldn't necessarily think that your opinions are equal to the opinions of others.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about that.
So if I was sitting down at a city hall meeting and they were making policies and having debates surrounding perhaps a new infrastructure bill coming in and what kind of concrete should they use on 14th Street that year, I don't know anything about appropriate concretes to use. So in that scenario, my voice shouldn't be elevated, and the voice of people that do know what they're talking about should be elevated. And even if I do have an opinion on it, but I'm not actually knowledgeable of what I'm talking about, I think in that scenario, my opinion doesn't really matter as much as those that are trained in that profession.
Do you believe in democracy?
Yes.
Do you believe that the democratic process requires that everyone's voice be heard?
I believe in a democratic republic, so everyone's voice can be heard, but it could be filtered to actual professionals that are versed in policy, in the example of running a government, and that they should have the final say.
Chris?
In terms of what question?
Any?
I would say, from your voice being heard, I would say I answer all three of those questions. One, I think it depends in terms of your voice. So, for example, to Brian's point in terms of the infrastructure bill and they're citing the concrete. I don't think that you don't necessarily have to know about concrete to have an opinion in that conversation. I think you can ask the question even though you don't know about the concrete, like why choose a particular concrete for 14th Street, so I can understand why you're choosing it. Because even though that may not know the ins and outs of construction and concrete laying, you can understand why they're choosing X, Y, and Z. But I do think that everyone's voice shouldn't be heard if it's going to affect or injure people, like hurt people. For example, like if you're offensive to people, regardless of race or sexual orientation, and you're very, very violent in your speaking.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that you should be able to say those things because you can conjure up a group who thinks like you to actually go out and affect and injure and hurt other people. In that case, I don't think your voice should be heard in that regard. But if it's about helping others, if it's about, regardless if you're the lowest on the totem pole to the highest, I think that yes, your voice should be heard if it's in betterment of other people in that regard.
Melody says that she thinks that if what you're listening to feels like nothing but noise, it's a good time to stay quiet. So maybe that's a direction that we can take the conversation in. But I wanted to, before we go into that, tell a story about another situation, it is, in which someone chose to have her voice heard. But whether you feel like this was a way of having it heard that really was expressive or constructive, or what you think about this sort of vocalization. So there was a friend of mine who is an older woman, and she and her husband moved into a very exclusive gated community in a very, very prosperous part of the United States. And they are people that are very, very financially successful and very free-spirited, very colorful, very open, very adventurous, and great senses of humor. I'll just say that. Now, there was a circle of other women about her age or older who regularly met for afternoon tea. And she was invited to tea and crumpets with these ladies.
Crumpets? Whoa.
Yeah, fancy schmancy, are we not? Seriously, I didn't even know they had crumpets in the United States. And in any event, while they were eating their crumpets and drinking their tea, my friend decided that they were boring and stuffy. And she wanted to have her voice heard in the conversation, although she didn't really know what about. So she decided to, well, really what she wanted to have her voice heard about was the fact that they were boring and petty and gossipy and all that sort of stuff. So she decided to, and just generally overly conservative. So she decided to change the topic to the subject of cannibalism. And all of a sudden she started asking them whether they would eat people and under what circumstances. For instance, if they were starving to death after a plane crash, would they kill someone and eat them? Would they eat the body after it was dead? And I think she got the message across because they never invited her to have tea and crumpets with them again. In fact, they all pretended like she didn't exist at any point afterwards. Do you think that she needed to have her voice heard that way?
I mean, it's tea and crumpets. It's a social setting where it's kind of like, what is the topic of conversation at tea and crumpets? Like flower arrangements for so you can really talk about anything in that type of setting. Now, if that woman got up in front of like the engineering bureau and they were all talking about, how to like, the subject matter was how to like code, some type of new tech. And she's like, hey, let's change the subject to cannibalism. Then that wouldn't necessarily be an appropriate setting, but that was a social setting. And, if they're talking about what they're interested in, why not talk about cannibalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to understand who you're having a drink and tea and crumpets with, right? Because, but it's like, like if I'm out to eat, we're having a conversation and somebody brings up cannibalism, I'm like, what in the what? It's like, it will throw me off. I don't know. Like why all of a sudden cannibalism is like a thing, It's just like what, like to be honest, like
especially if they're licking their lips while and they're looking at you,
and they're holding their knife and a fork, hanging it against the table with a psychotic look.
Yeah, but like for me, I would be more so curious, like why would you bring that up at a tea and crumpets? Like why does like that? Like what did I miss? And then it's like, yeah, I don't know. Personally, I don't want to talk about cannibalism if I'm having tea. To me, that's it's a social setting. It's like a calming setting, and cannibalism it's like a weird thing to talk about. I don't know if there's any value I can add to that conversation.
Well, let me ask you this. My husband always tells me that I like to zing people. And in social settings where I decide, maybe I like this woman, she was my secret hero, because I could relate. When I'm bored with people, I think they're just talking about stuff that's silly. Every now and then, I can't help myself. I have to bring up something shocking. And I love seeing the jaws drop or people get discombobulated that way. And I love seeing where the conversation goes. And I love seeing who laughs and who gets it. I love seeing who's horrified and says, what a freak show I am. I don't care what they think. What do you all think about people like me? Do you think I need to not have my voice heard as much?
No, not at all. No, I would literally be more curious than anything. Like, Scott, you bring up cannibalism. Like, what about cannibalism that you want to talk about?
Well, Melody has a good point. Maybe that's an entree to talk about the soul, because after all, after you're eating, your spirit's going somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, Scott, I would. Let's say I met you for that first time at the tea and crumpets thing, and you brought up cannibalism, and it was also my first time there. I would then say, I'm not going to hang out with these crumpet ladies. I found my guy, Scott Mason, and we're going to be talking about weird stuff from this day on, because to me, it's the eclectic kind of things in life that are the most interesting. Now, I don't know what those other women were talking about, so maybe they were interesting too, but probably not as interesting as cannibalism.
Well, that being said, when and how do you all know what is appropriate for the voicing of your opinion or of your particular thoughts, particularly in a social setting? We'll leave work aside, because in a way that's an easier case. Social settings are a little bit more different. And maybe even a quasi-social setting. So when I was in law school, I had a professor he taught civil procedure. And for those of you who don't know what civil procedure is, it's basically the rules governing lawsuits. And there have been a series of court cases that involve civil procedure decisions that govern what is appropriate under the Constitution for the processing of lawsuits. And one of these cases was, the plaintiff's name was Hansberry. It was Hansberry versus blah, blah, blah. Hansberry sued to try and remove restrictive covenants that were keeping African Americans out of certain housing developments. And basically, the case was dismissed on civil procedure grounds. Now, the court had jurisdiction and had latitude as to how it chose to interpret the civil service laws and the actual statutes that were in controversy. And the teacher just told us, look, this was a neutral decision. They made it. They did the best that they could, and this is what the law is. And there was a student who raised his hand in that class and said, that's bull. Hansberry happened to be the famous playwright Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun. The whole lawsuit had been a setup for them to force a decision to either have this racially based decision on the books or not. And it's not some just sort of neutral lawsuit outcome about a decision. And he called the professor out on the spot in front of 100+ people. And then there was a rally a little bit later about diversity and equity at the law school, and he raised that story again. And do you know that teacher decided later to make sure on his own he raised that whole story behind this? So the question is, and a lot of people, when that student said that, were saying that's inappropriate. The teacher leads the discussion in this classroom, not the students. We're here to learn. Who is he, some first-year law student, to call out this professor that's famous on this topic and basically call him a racist in front of everybody? Thoughts about whether that student should have had his voice heard in that setting at that time in that way?
I have some thoughts. Chris.
Go ahead, Brian.
All right. So I'm conflicted. So I'll be honest. I don't know if I have an answer, but I'll tell you the two conflicts. So I've trained in martial arts for years, and there's this one etiquette thing that if the instructor is speaking in error or teaches a technique that perhaps they do something wrong with it, it's considered highly inappropriate for the student to correct the instructor.
That's true.
In front of the class.
Yep.
It's more appropriate afterwards to take the instructor to the side and say, hey, I've always learned it this way. And then later it's on the instructor to correct him or herself. So there's that one part of my mind that is like, maybe it would have been more appropriate to privately have this conversation with the professor rather than publicly. On the other end of the spectrum, there is this idea that if you allow even small lies to fester, that creates a precedent for bigger and bigger lies to begin to manifest themselves. So it's better to nip them in the bud when the lie is said than it is to allow them to continue to grow. So I don't know if I have an answer because this is a tough one, Scott.
Okay, Scott, you said that the calling out of the professor who was revered in this subject, it led to what again? It led to like the
professor in another class that I didn't mention, that the person, right, he basically told the whole backstory of this lawsuit to the class, and basically said, he didn't say it in so many words, but this was a civil rights case. It wasn't just a simple civil procedure matter, and the plaintiff was someone who was world famous at the time, and that had something to do with the outcome of this. It wasn't just, let's interpret this according to some principle. That's basically what he said.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understand before I get it. So the student called the teacher out for making this. Was anything in the teacher's teaching racist at the time, or was he bringing it forward, like, as opposed to looking at it in a civil way? It was more.
Well, that goes as to another interesting point, because this particular professor Also was called out by that same student. I don't remember if he did it publicly or not, but he was called out. I know that there was a lot of discussion about that professor using a certain word that sounds like another word related to African Americans that you do not say.
Got it. So he used so the reason he called him what he called him in front of people based off of a fact that he knew about the professor.
Fact, the professor, I'm sure, would have said, "I'm not a racist."
Got it. Okay.
On his, and I don't want to diminish anyone's point of view.
No,
I'm
100%.
trying to be sensitive here, but not let my own bias creep into the story.
Of course.
But on how some of the students, at least, were perceiving the behavior patterns of this particular professor.
Got it. Man, this is a really tough question because if he felt that, or whoever was felt that what the teacher was saying was either offensive or wrong, and you're doing it in a public fashion. But also, what year was this?
This was years ago.
Years
I won't
ago.
say when. I'm slightly changing some things, by the way, to protect the innocent.
Got it. Okay, so man, see, I'm sorry, my mind goes like to question, and then I gotta give answer. But anyways, I think that if you feel like something is offensive or wrong and it's publicly, I actually don't mind the correction of the professor. Now it's if there's way, you always, there's this saying that it doesn't matter what you say, it's how you say it, right? So it's like if the person is saying something wrong, even though if they're revered and it's offensive, there's ways to do things. But again, I can't speak to the mindset of that person because maybe there's some experiences that happened in the background or before that lesson that led that person to react the way that they reacted. So I'm like Brian, I'm conflicted. I don't think I know enough about the story to give like a definitive answer, to be honest.
Well, so we'll leave the story aside then and talk generally about this issue of tact. If you have to be tactful when you're expressing your voice, are you actually suppressing your voice?
It depends. That depends.
Why?
In my mind, my opinion, I'm sorry. It depends. Because if you're for example, if you're in the civil rights movement, let's just say, and it's been things that's been done a certain way, in order to get attention, you have to be loud in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, especially if you're trying to change things, that's been the norm for a very long time. But if it's a simple discussion of where someone revered is leading a discussion, whether it's let's just say, leave it out that it's offensive. Let's just say the person. Let's just say I'm teaching something and I'm wrong, and Brian says, "Hey, Mr. Sykes, I appreciate you leading this lecture, but I think that you're mistaken in points 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Now, my ego and pride may be hurt because I'm such a renowned person in this field, but if I'm corrected in the right way, aside my feelings being hurt, I don't think I would have an issue. I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
I'd like to talk on tact. Okay, so I think that tact, by its definition, would imply that being tactful somehow benefits your efforts. So I don't think there's anything wrong with using tact, because even in being tactful, there might be some circumstances that you have to be loud.
For sure.
Because tactfulness or like adroitness is effectively being clever in the way that you do and say and choose to do things. So I think that having tact in conversations is universally important, and it still allows you like if you are bringing up a civil rights issue where you need to be loud, you can be loud and that would still be considered tactful, because within that scenario, that is the clever way or the right way to move the chess piece. It might be the way I would say it.
What about profanity? I have a foul mouth. I
Me
love
too.
to swear.
I
And I
do too.
especially love to swear in situations in which it's inappropriate. I love it. I love it. And I'm confident and independent enough to generally be able to get away with it too.
You know what?
Go
Oh,
ahead.
I don't know. Okay. For example, right? Let's as a general thing, I would say I love to curse. Brian will tell you. I have a foul mouth myself. But I think that in certain settings you have to be tactful in that. For example, if I'm trying to be the president of the United States and I'm like, man, F these so and so's and I really highly doubt that I will hold that office. If you now or well, no. Okay. I know exactly where we are going. But in terms of now, before that, but I'm saying, you know, but or if I take it back to the, I don't know, this is tough because if I take like if you go back to like the 60s and how they got things done, would MLK be as effective if he was on TV speaking for everybody from a civil rights standpoint, if he used all those words?
Yeah.
And like would he have gotten across the same message if it was tainted by profanity? Like even like for example, like Brian and I, by profession, we're advisors in the financial space, right? When I meet a client, even though I like to curse, I'm not about to use all type of profane language in the presence of my client or my prospect, because I'm not trying to come off across a certain way.
No, and that is true. I have to admit, if I'm meeting with a client or if I am speaking in front of a group, I really try and be careful. Sometimes I'll swear. Depends on the age of the group, the casualness of the surroundings, the geographical location. What I would say to, for instance, a Toastmasters group here in New York City, full of young people that's informal, is different than if I were giving a speech at the headquarters of a major accounting firm or meeting with a banker versus, you know, I don't know, the members of an art commune.
That is like the perfect example. It's like, which ones is he going to pull? And you literally picked the perfect example. Yeah, I mean,
Brian, are you prim and proper with your mouth?
It depends on the setting. It depends on the setting. Like if I'm in the presence of you know, priests and nuns, then I curse a lot. No, then
I actually would.
Yeah. But like Chris said, it depends on the setting. If it's a professional setting, I try to refrain from profanity. But I think that profanity, when used tactfully, can actually make people feel a bit more comfortable, because I think most people curse.
Yeah,
but
sure.
It's like one of those things where, you know, it's almost like you're in the club when you're comfortable enough to curse in front of one another. So if you could use it in some circumstances to show like, hey, look, I'll drop a little curse here and there, which means that I feel comfortable enough around you to say shit. You know what I mean? And then it's like, oh, well, I guess I don't have to keep up this formality because this person cursed and now maybe I can give a little bit too. But I think you could go overboard with it. I think there's something just kind of gross about somebody that just cursing. It's just very unattractive.
I mean, you wouldn't use that like if you're at a kid's birthday party and it's nothing but like 2-3-year-olds who are running around, and then you get up and take the mic and just go off. Like I'm pretty sure that parents would be like, who the hell is this dude? Like what is
Maybe
wrong?
like they'd start swearing.
They'll start cursing because of like you see all these little, and kids are very impressionable, so they'll hear that and then come home and then they'll start saying the word, right? When you don't want them to do that at this particular age. So I think it all depends on the setting. But like I think Melody said it, you got to know your audience.
Yeah. And Melody, by the way, we have been, I don't know if you are watching or listening, but we've been putting your comments up on the screen for everyone to see, and they are very much appreciated. Now, one thing that I also just want to ask then on a related topic is, how do you decide when, where, and how you want to shut someone's voice down?
Oh, I'm so bad at that. I just had to deal with this like a little while ago. I'm the type that'll let them talk. I'm the type that'll let them talk because I feel like and I don't know if I'm wrong in being this way, and there's a strong chance that I am. I think that when people have the opportunity to talk, it's a very cathartic, enjoyable experience for them. And in many circumstances, I'll allow them to talk because usually if people are talking a lot, it's because maybe a lot of people aren't listening to them. And I almost view it as like community service or something like that. You know,
I'm the opposite. Because it depends. You got to say it in a tactful way. It depends on, like, you know, for Brian's example, I know exactly what example he's talking about. If it's something that has to deal with, like, if I have to get something done or I feel like this is going nowhere, I would say, you know, excuse me, I have to, you know, I have to go. Or if it's for what Brian is talking about, and this is not the setting for that, or I can't use this particular thing, I would have to politely interrupt and tell them to, okay, I don't think this is going to be a good thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just think that, you know, and Brian's probably right, because you see it all the time with older people, at least my clients, right? If I'm being honest, like they'll talk and talk and talk because they have no one to talk to. So like Brian said, it's very cathartic for them to have somebody listening to them. In that case, again, it all depends. Like in that case, I'll let a client talk to me just to tell me about their day and their week and things of that nature. I'll just sit there and just listen. And then literally at the end of the conversation, they thought that we had a conversation, but it was them talking for 30 minutes. And they're so appreciative of that. But it all depends on the setting itself.
Go ahead, Brian.
it also depends on, if I'm being honest, what I'm getting out of it too, right? So like if I'm walking on the street and there's this guy by me who's famous for, he's probably got some issues, but he's famous for coming up and saying that there's like 3 holes that are entranceways to hell in Oliphant, Pennsylvania. And if you sit there and listen to this man, he will talk to you for like 4.5 hours about the 3 holes to hell in Oliphant, Pennsylvania. And he just goes on and on and on and on and on. I'm not going to sit there and listen to that guy even for like 2 seconds, because I know that I'm not going to get anything out of listening to this man talking. But in the circumstance of a client, a friend, a family member, where there is some like reciprocal, like you're my buddy or you're my aunt or you're somebody that I do business with, then I'm a little bit more apt to allow, you to just talk and without any restraint.
No, 100%. I think everyone's like that to a degree.
I do think it depends. First of all, before I go into that a little bit further, Joseph, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. Please keep commenting. Not only are we grateful to have heard your thoughts, for you to have expressed your voice, but we want to have you keep on doing that, because if you disagree with us, if you have feeling states one way or another about anything we say, or that Melody or Jessica or anyone else who's on the call has to say, all that does is further enlighten us each and broaden all of our horizons together. And that's one of the beauties of being involved in a show like this. Now, I actually really appreciate your compassion, both of you, when it comes to people talking and talking and talking. Older people, and Joseph says it's hard, it has to be reciprocal. And that is a big, big deal for me. And I want to talk about that a little bit more. Now, there are some situations, let's say a person has Alzheimer's, where they're just talking, they don't really know what they're saying. So, of course, you're not going to judge them. I hope someone would not judge them, negatively because of that, or expect that they can be reciprocal when they just don't have the mental capacity to be reciprocal. And I know, Joseph, you're not talking about that scenario. And sometimes I just think with the aging process, elderly people, sometimes I suspect either they're lonely, like you said, Chris, or they're downloading their lives before they go, is how I sort of interpret it. And they talk a lot, and I want to hear those stories, and I want them to have that chance, because I may want that chance myself one day. However,
100%.
one of the things that you all both talked about is other situations where it may not be as clear. A lot of times I feel when people are just talking, having their voice heard is either at the expense of everyone else, or it's a sign of a narcissism that I'm having to endure. And that I personally have no patience with. The problem is, from my perspective, and that I actually do believe in shutting down pretty strongly, because what we tolerate, we endorse. And so if it really is just every time you meet with that person, they're just talking about me. And yes, her voice needs to be heard and all that sort of stuff, but it's boring. It's not reciprocal, like Joseph just talked about, or anything else. I feel like I'm endorsing it. Now, that being said, I can never really tell. I'm not a clinical psychotherapist, so I have my opinions, but they may not be true. What do you all feel about those situations? And Melody says that is a hard situation to handle. Melody, girl, yes, it is definitely. And Joseph,
go
ahead, Chris.
What did Joe say? At times my clients do not
clarify. And I have to attempt to direct the conversation. So
Scott, you have an amazing podcast, Scott Mason's Purpose Highway podcast, right?
I do indeed.
Right. So if someone comes on your show and you ask them a question, and for 45 minutes they talk, it's not even what you want. It has nothing to do with the show. I think before it gets to a point, you either going to have to. I think it is appropriate at that point, because you have to feed not only the guest is important, but I think the audience is more important because of what they're getting out of your show, right? So if they like every week, every Tuesday, I tune into Scott Mason's show, and they have these deep conversations about X, Y, and Z, and then that's what your audience is used to. They tune in, they're subscribed, they're just a Scott Mason fan. They tune in to this person, or you have a person on, and you ask them, "So Scott, tell me about yourself," and then you tell them about, and then you just rant, and it's like, where's the this is not for my audience. So at that point, you would be like, no, this is not it. Like, we have to have a conversation, because I'm trying to feed my audience something, because they're relying on me to deliver an experience to them.
Would you say that publicly on a podcast, though, Chris?
Like on a podcast? Like, no, I wouldn't air the show.
I mean, that's what I do. I junk the show.
Yeah, or I would stop. Well, I would say, okay, wait a minute. We have to, because knowing that the show is not going to air, I would say this is more so like a conversational kind of show. So we have a topic, and we kind of go back to kind of let them know, but 9 times out of 10, Brian and I let the guests know what the show format is like. Yeah. And if we say what the show format is like, and we ask you a question, and then you go on for 52 minutes, then I have to step in and say, this is not what our audience is looking for. Like, they want to hear a conversational style show.
Yeah,
personally.
I mean, even on Scott's show, Scott's really good at getting deep really fast with his guest. So if Scott says, "So tell me a little bit about yourself," and they're walking you through all of their tribulations of like middle school, and Scott's got like 12 deep questions that he wants to ask about metaphysics, but we never get to it because this guy or this lady's talking about, their upbringing in, Louisiana, you're not actually going to get what you wanted out of that conversation either. So I think that in a way you almost owe it to the audience to do something and step in, because they might 100%. Actually have valuable information. And the only other thing I want to say on this is sometimes people will incessantly talk because they actually are like, it's like a version of stage fright in a way.
Mhm.
And they don't know how to stop because they just keep going and going and going and going and going, and they don't know when to actually end. So rather than awkwardly and abruptly end, they'll just go until hopefully somebody jumps in and stops them. Sometimes they're even thankful when you stop them because they weren't going to stop themselves.
Well, how do you all know? This raises an interesting side point that I wanted to get into. And this goes as to Joseph, Jessica, Melody. How do you know how to interpret situations in which your own voice has been silenced?
How do you know?
And thank you for that comment. You have to be able to steer the conversation. That goes as to what Joseph said. And if you all have any thoughts about things that have worked or not worked when it comes to steering a conversation, make sure that you leave them in the remarks. Folks reading this now, later, may actually benefit from that.
Hmm.
Can you repeat the question, Scott?
Yeah, I
How
was just
do
about to
you
say.
know how to interpret then the intent or the lesson to be learned from, if any, from when your own voice has been shut down
I think
or not heard?
I think in a situation where you're always interrupted. For example, if you ask me a question about an opinion and I try to start explaining my opinion, you're like, but Chris, you da. Well, yes, Scott, but you know, but then well, like it's like you're almost not letting me you're not letting me elaborate my thought. And then at that point, you know, in a tactful way, depending on like because it like if I'm getting continue to be cut off, you know, I would ask, hey, you know, Brian or whoever, do you mind if I continue to? For I'm gonna give you a perfect example. This is why Brian and I are very very close in terms of like being honest with each other. In the beginning of the podcast, when we first started it, I would talk too much, and Brian but Brian before he asks questions likes to think and then respond. But me, I would just ask a question. I guess would get an answer, and then I'm on to the question. And then Brian was like, Chris, he didn't say, dude, like forget doing this podcast. I'm not doing it no more because you never allow me to talk. He said, Chris, to be honest, I feel like I don't talk enough because you take over the show. You don't allow me to fester the answer, come up with my own thoughts, and then respond. I was extremely grateful for that because I don't ever want him to feel like that. So I think in terms of silencing your voice, if you feel like you're not being heard, you can always say, hey, listen, do you mind me explaining what I need to do or getting my point across? And then if the person ignores that, then you have to be a little bit more forceful in your wording to say, hey, listen, I'm trying to talk here and you continue to cut me off.
That's a good point. You know, you have to be able to, I mean, I guess voice your opinion on it. So if you feel that you're not being heard, you know, have the bravery to say something about it. And, you know, luckily with Chris's scenario, we're friends, so it's easy. But using the example that, you know, you had, Scott, where like the mayor would shut down people, you have to have some cojones to stand before the mayor and say, Mayor, whoever, I've been wanting to say these things, but I do not feel comfortable because I'm afraid that you're going to somehow retaliate against me. Like that takes guts to do that. So if you feel like you're not being heard, you might need to be courageous depending on the circumstance and voice that you don't feel that you're being listened to.
Well, and to be clear, it wasn't the mayor himself that I was dealing with. It was usually like a deputy mayor or one of his aides or something like that. So I don't want anyone accusing me of like getting into arguments with the mayor of New York City. I wasn't that bold. But I totally hear what you're saying. I was in a situation recently where I was at a conference that I paid a very pretty penny to be part of. It was a virtual conference. And the facilitator had the option as part of his leadership to call on different people in the group and ask them for their opinions or their thoughts or whatever. And he kept going back to the same people over and over and over again. Finally, I had enough of it. And so I actually did send via Zoom a private DM to someone that was a co-facilitator saying, what's going on? Other people are raising their hands. Can other people please be given a chance to speak? as fascinating as this, I wasn't a jerk about it, at least I hope I wasn't, as fascinating as this one person is that you keep going back to over and over again, right? Like, is it possible to make the group participation a little bit more inclusive? And that was heard, but there was a part of me that was ambivalent inside. I was speaking up for myself and saying, yeah, I want to be heard, or I want to hear other people, but then I feel like I'm being kind of a jerk. Do you all ever feel that when that happens, that internal sort of tension? And if so, how do you deal with it? And I will just, before you give you all a chance to think about that, but I will also say thank you to Joseph for his remark. Situational awareness is your go-to when others can't get a word in. That's my sign to stop. I'm sort of slightly interpreting that there. And I will say, I tend to agree with that, and that's how I try to operate. But a challenge I have is not understanding when people don't notice that no one else is talking but them, or they don't appear to. Brian, you've actually given me some insight about that. And then Melody says that she re-listens to the show when I'm a guest. And I will confess, one of the very earliest podcasts I did, when I listened to myself, she asked me to talk a little bit about my background. I went through my whole career history. Like, who gives a darn? I cringe even thinking about that. It's embarrassing. And that's out there for everyone to hear for the rest of my life. I want to just go in a hole and die.
You know what, Scott?
I shudders you get.
I want to, and I'm very curious to hear you and Brian's thought about this, but I want to answer your question in terms of, do you ever feel a certain way? I think everybody feels a certain way if they feel like they're going to say something that's not the norm, like in a setting. Mm-hmm. Even the people who look like they're doing it comfortably, I think they still have a knot in their stomach before they raise their hand and kind of do things. And I think that I think when most people who want to say something are glad when somebody else does it and say, like, oh God, I don't have to do it. Like, I think most people shut down when the uncomfortable feeling comes up, that they know this is the right thing to do, but they don't want to be the person to do it because of how it's deemed. But I will ask this question. In this day and age, can anyone's voice be silenced?
Wow.
Because if you create 10 fake social media accounts and put some boosting behind there to target certain people, and regardless if you go to a city hall meeting or a Zoom call, your message can go viral now, right? Yeah. Regardless of how big or small or influential you are. So in this day and age, in terms of getting your point across or getting your thing, like, in this day and age, is there such thing as somebody's voice being silenced, when they can just pick up their phone, record a video, and put it out there to the world?
So, Joseph, you answered that question with a pretty emphatic no. But I'm curious if you could explain a little bit more what you meant by that. I do want to respond to why you're saying no, just whether it is to take the conversation a little further or to challenge ourselves. So just let us know a little bit more about what you're thinking, especially what no means. And I appreciate your patience with me in asking that. Brian. Are you ever going to shut up?
I think that listening is very important. What is it? We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? So I think to Chris's point, can anybody not be heard? I don't know if that was the exact way he said it, but that's the gist. I think that it's a lot easier now to get your opinion broadcasted all over the place, but it's still not that easy. I mean, if it were easy, then all of our podcasts would be like number one on the whole planet. If it was super easy to have your voice proclaimed all over like the globe, right? So it's a lot easier. Like, I could take a video of myself, put it on Facebook now, and all like 200 people, might see it if I'm lucky. Really, it's going to be like my mom, my wife, and like my aunt, right? But they'll see it. The chance of it being proclaimed throughout, the whole internet unless it's like super controversial or dynamic in some way or interesting, I think most people really don't care about what most people are saying.
Before we go any further, I wanted to take a second to welcome back to the show someone who we love. Kenny Dunner, welcome. I don't know if you've had a chance to meet Brian or Chris yet, but Kenny's a regular participant on the show. He's been away for a while. I assume he's been busy, but it has not been the same without you. And we absolutely love having you here, Kenny. And you always bring some serious sauce into the room. And so I ask that you do that tonight. And then Joseph says a couple of interesting things. The only person that can silence me is me. And then he mentions the mindset of being silenced. Do you all agree that there is such a thing as a mindset of being silenced?
Yeah, you could be like a walking mat. You could be the type of person where you're like, Scott, I have something. Oh, okay, you're talking. All right, well, never mind. I guess I'll just shut up then. So that is like an energy that you can carry yourself, that somebody could have. But I don't know. I don't think a lot of. I don't know about that. I don't think it's a mindset of being silenced. I think it's just an overall lack of confidence.
I think in terms of like your mindset being silenced, yeah. I think that like you said, like if it depends on like if you're that person who's easily discouraged, right? If you're easily discouraged, then yeah, you can be silenced because the moment that you step out on a limb and you get backlash, you just freeze and don't say anything anymore because of what you said or whatever the case may be. Yeah, I think a mindset can be silenced depending on it depends on who the person is. But again, if you believe in your message enough, good or bad, it's very, very hard to get silenced. Extremely hard to get silenced if you believe in what your messaging is.
Do you all believe, though, and I asked this to Joseph and Kenny as well, as always, Jessica and Melody, but specifically to Kenny and Joseph because it's embedded in what they said, which is that let's say you have a silence mindset, or you are one of those people that's very timid, or you're afraid, or whatever. And hey, I've been there myself. Do other people have a responsibility to make sure that you are being heard? If you notice that someone's silent, oh, what a delight! We also have. Did I see? Yes, I see Gloria Sanchez in the house. Gloria, welcome. It is so good to have you here. Thank you for joining us, and please participate. We want everyone's voice to be heard, at least during this show tonight. And I've got to say, Kenny says, try me. I dare you. Kenny, you're the only person in the history of this show who has had the gumption to tell me to put a rake in my hair and get a different hairstyle. I wouldn't dare try and silence you.
So you said do you think it's other people's responsibility to make sure everyone's
Do you all
heard?
think that we have a responsibility if people are being silenced, or if we see that they're the timid ones or maybe the shy ones, to reach out and be there and let them have that confidence that Joseph and Kenny are talking about?
I think it depends because it depends on that person. Like for example, like if we're in a setting like this and the person wants to say something, but they you're like Chris, we haven't heard from you all. Do you mind speaking? I'm like, no, I don't. I just like to hear to listen. Like at that point, you gave the person the opportunity. Like, well, no, Chris, I really do believe that your opinion is it should be heard. And I'm like, no, I'm good. At that point, I'm like, no, because not saying that because that's something to me. That's something deeper than that. Right? Is it something deeper than not speaking, like your voice not being heard? So you have something that you have to deal with. So with confidence, if you can come out, so that you think that your voice is important enough to say something about an opinion or about a topic. I think you can give that person a chance, but ultimately it's up to that person to speak their mind.
Yeah, I mean, if first of all, I think it's a leadership trait if you have the ability to see that there's somebody being silenced or is not speaking up for themselves, and then to get the whole room to be quiet so that person has the opportunity to speak But to Chris's point, perhaps they're not comfortable yet to speak. So you don't want to keep saying, you talk, talk, talk. And they might, have like a panic attack because they have a fear of public speaking, and you just keep calling them out to talk. Or, you read the room. Like if I was sitting in a room of, I keep using engineers as an example, because I recently spoke to some engineers and they're just scary smart. So if I'm sitting in a big room of engineers and they're going off about all these mathematical equations and they go, Brian, you're being awfully quiet. Do you have anything to add? I'm going to be like, I got nothing to add. Nothing. And if they're like, please tell us your thoughts on these equations, I'd be like, I told you, I have nothing to add. So in that scenario, me speaking up for myself, I have no issue not speaking up for myself in that scenario. I will gladly sit there and listen.
Do you agree with what I'm reading Joseph to have said in his remark, which is that sometimes the silencers need to be silenced by the voices of those who might otherwise be silenced, or at a minimum, the voices of those who have the capacity to silence them on the behalf of the silenced?
I mean, I guess it depends how, right? I mean, like as a parent, if the two kids are arguing and saying, you shut up, no, you shut up, then dad comes in and says, no, you both shut up. So then I'm silencing the silencer,
Yeah.
So and then you take that all the way up, and I guess I guess there is a chain of command, right? All the way up to the president of the United States. But I think that it's important that there is some mechanism to silence the silencer if the silencer becomes unethical, flawed, corrupt.
100%. I agree.
So, Kenny and Joseph, if you all connect with each other because of the show, that's a big part of what we're about here. We love seeing that sort of thing. And I, in fact, encourage anyone who is in the audience of this show who is compelled by something that they read or that they have heard from either the hosts of the show or those that are participating to please connect with each other. This is about community building. This is about amazing people getting to know each other, doing some epic stuff. Now, did I silence Oleg? Kenny, Oleg wasn't able to make it tonight. It's just not quite the same without him. We know that. I will tell him that you were asking about him, but he will never let me silence him. However, I'm glad that you're here tonight because Brian and Chris are going to be regular co-hosts once a month with us. And so they're going to want to get to know you as well as Oleg. And then Joseph says those that attempt to silence are
all need to be checked.
Need to be checked.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Silence all.
And then that's what we need to do is to unite our community. I could not agree more with that. Absolutely. 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 Now, do we feel that there is a time in which truly wiping out an entire meta voice is appropriate? And this is controversial because and by meta voice, I mean the voice of an entire people about something. An example, obviously, that everyone would talk about would be Nazism. In Germany, it's basically illegal to be out there spouting Nazi propaganda, and I think understandably so, considering their history. It's hard to say, oh, they're being completely unreasonable. That being said, here in the United States, Nazi propaganda is, I don't know that it's socially tolerated, but it's legally tolerated. It's not morally tolerated by the majority, I would hope, but it is nonetheless an ideology that we as a society, as with any ideology, chosen to say we are not going to silence it by threatening you with prison or with fines or whatever if you choose to advocate for it. So when I talk about meta silencing, that's the sort of thing that I mean.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what it actually means to silence them. Okay. I don't know how they silence the Nazi party in Germany right now. Like I'm assuming that they prevent rallies from occurring, or they probably have some type of filter online so they can't put up propaganda. Beyond that, I don't know. But
I would assume some type of punishment. I think there's just like saying something is illegal doesn't really prevent people from doing it. I think that what prevents people from doing it is the consequence behind your action, right? So like if I know that if I steal something, I get caught and my hand's going to get cut off. It's a very low probability I'm going to steal something, right? So I don't know what they have in place for making it illegal in Germany, but I'm pretty sure it's like some kind of it's a huge penalty.
I mean, I don't think it's okay to silence an opinion. I think it's okay to prevent the promulgation of certain opinions, but I don't think it's okay to silence the opinion. Like if there was a whole crew of cannibals, right, that were hanging out in New York, and they're like, look, cannibalism makes sense. Cannibalism is delicious. Cannibalism is good. Fine, you freaks can all stand there and say that, but the second you try to eat one of us, then we need to step in and do something about it. But I'd let them say it.
I think it all depends on shock value, if I'm being honest. Because it's like, okay, for example, let's just say there's a group of people in New York City saying, I hate kids, I want to kill all kids. This like should you allow them to say that opinion? Like, I can't stand babies, I want to end, right? No, like, so, but would you allow that because that's that's their opinion and things of that nature, but that's a very violent and visceral and shocking thing to say. You know what I'm saying? That you want to, go back to the Old Testament. It's crazy. I think you got you see what I'm saying? Like it's like cannibalism is one thing. If you're like, yeah, I don't think anything is wrong with killing, but when you're trying to harm somebody and that's what you're for, and then you create rallies and everything around that, that's when it becomes dangerous. Because 9 times out of 10, if people feel strongly about that, like it's always going to be a few people that feel strongly about what somebody's saying. And then that turns into an action kind of thing. And then all of us, then it's like, wait a minute, before it gets to a point to where babies start disappearing, should we go ahead and nip this in the bud now? So I think that's a thing.
I mean, so I just have to make it clear.
Go ahead, Scott.
Kenny, we don't think you're a cannibal here. We don't think you're a cannibal. I promise we would never accuse you of that sort of thing. And thank you for being here, even if it is, as you mentioned earlier, fashionably late. Kenny, we would not want anything but fashionable from you. Thank you so much for that. Go ahead, Brian.
I mean, I think letting people, going back to that whole catharsis and letting people just say what they want to say thing as an effective way to, be a contributing member to society applies to this subject matter too. Let's use the cannibal example, just because it's silly and not, really going to happen. I think if you repress their ability to discuss it, it would actually draw more attention to the cause than just letting the 30 people in New York that want to be cannibals just gather, have a little, hopefully non-human picnic, and just let them do it. And don't make a fuss about it. Don't let them hurt people. But then at the end of the thing, they pack up their bags and they go and they say what they had to say, and it's done.
Gloria, thank you, by the way, for adding some factual information here. We weren't 100% clear. It was my understanding that there was a penalty associated with this. Gloria is in from Luxembourg tonight, and so she's much more closer to the physical proximity of that part of the discussion. And then Melody, I think the Roseanne Barr example is quite interesting because there wasn't a financial or a legal penalty that she paid for the things that she felt was important to say on Twitter. And she had her right to speech. No one silenced her immediately, but there were consequences. That being said, at least here in the United States, a lot of times, going to your point, Chris, you'll hear, well, if the consequences are severe enough, it really is limiting me. And so I really am being silenced. And Roseanne, I think, might say that privately, although I think the consequences in her case, being that they were the entire end of her career, probably would not say that publicly.
Well, okay. So, for example, I think that controlling things to a degree is appropriate because, like, for example, if I think severe consequences, alter human behavior. For example, right, in America, if you kill somebody, it's trial. It's you could get off if you have the right lawyer, you know. So it's not like a thing where, like, if I kill somebody, yeah, I could potentially go to jail for the rest of my life, or I could potentially be put, get the death penalty. But before that happens, there's a lot of steps in between that I could, if I hire the right criminal defense lawyer, and things of that nature, that could potentially get me off based on circumstances. And I don't, again, I don't know any facts, but I'm assuming in other parts of the world, if you kill them, there is no trial, there is no lawyer, there is no potentially getting off. Something very visceral and public is going to happen to you to deter that type of behavior, right? So if people feel that I can go around killing people or saying that, kill all babies. Like, it's like, because like Brian said, if there's some like cannibalism on it, whatever, and it doesn't seem like violent a little bit, it's like, okay, there's these people who believe in that, and they're sturdy people gathering around a picnic, hopefully non-human, like Brian said. But then those same 30 people took out a sign and says, kill all babies. And then it's like, wait a minute, like, yeah, that's your opinion for whatever reason, but that's not right to say. You're doing it in a park where there's nothing but kids and babies, right? So it's like, I think consequences, I think you have to silence a few people I think consequences automatically, or depending on how severe the consequence is. For example, like in America, if you kill somebody, forget it, then this is going to happen to you, period. I don't care what happens, right? Yes, that's controlling a situation, right? But then if it's another thing, I don't know. I think everything that we're talking about is gray, right? To be honest, it's in the gray area.
And that's where we like to go in this show. We dwell in the gray. Sometimes we start with extreme examples, but then we narrow down further and further and further to see how far those answers that we might give reflexively to questions that we're asked all the time that are based on assumptions within the extremes, how far they can really go. Because once you go in a certain level beyond the extreme or beyond the reflexive answer, that's when it becomes grayer and grayer and grayer. Eventually it moves into a different shade altogether. Well, what is that inflection point? Why is that inflection point there? And what does that say about the validity of your thinking in the first place?
So this makes me have
please.
a question for you, Scott, because
Of
Scott, you
course.
ask us so many questions, and I feel like that narcissist that you were talking about earlier.
I don't feel
where
like
I'm
you're a
just
narcissist.
I'm answering all these lovely questions. I'm not asking you any questions. All right. Here's a question for you. And being that you have a law background, this is extremely useful. Why was the freedom of speech an important part of the Constitution? Like, did you ever have to study why that was even something that they felt was necessary?
Yes, and I will say I'm not an expert in that area, so I will speak to my understanding and recollection of that, and then opinions about it as well. First of all, the freedom of speech is closely tied to the freedom of press. And you think about the history of the United States, it was one in which we had a repressive foreign government that had colonized the land that we were in, and at least according to the founders of the United States, taxing them and not giving them appropriate representation in the British Parliament. Not only that, but in a monarchy, the press was something that was controlled by the state, and so only one side or another could get out. And they really were concerned with making sure that if someone wanted to speak against whatever the leader is, I mean, they were basically badly burned by the experience of monarchy, and they wanted to make sure that all of the worst trappings of monarchy weren't incorporated or were not replicated here in the United States. So at the end of the day, that's where some of these other freedoms that are embedded into the Constitution come from, specifically the freedom of religion, which the Church of England has a national church, or freedom of association, or some of these other big freedoms that we associate with our Constitution. They correctly understood that if the press isn't free, there couldn't be a real dialogue, and eventually tyranny would creep back up. And the freedom to speak was something that they also viewed as necessary to both foster a Republican and a democratically rooted Republican style of government, but also to make sure that we weren't having, in a lot of these countries like England, it was against the law to speak negatively about the king. They really felt that's why they, in a way, why they had to have a revolution. They felt they had no voice. What the monarchy said or what the House of Parliament said, that was it for them. And so the revolution really, and you think about the Boston Tea Party, taxation without representation. They weren't unhappy with what the outcome of the deliberations that were happening in England might have been. They were unhappy with the fact that they didn't have a voice in it. So that's my suspicion and my recollection that could well be wrong about why that was placed first. It was placed first because it was viewed as fundamental, perhaps the most fundamental of all. However, it goes with an important caveat that we forget in this country, in my opinion. Freedom from a constitutional perspective is freedom from penalty by the government. It's not freedom from being criticized. It's not freedom from social rejection. It's not freedom from being fired. It's not freedom from, unless your employer is the government. It's not freedom to say or do whatever you want to without consequence, except insofar as the agent of that consequence is the government. And one other important caveat, so long as public safety is not at risk. The Declaration of Independence says that the truths or the what it stands for are in the following order: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. It doesn't say pursuit of happiness, liberty, and life. It doesn't say liberty, life, and pursuit of happiness, or any other variant. It says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And therefore, you think about that in connection with the Constitution. The government and the Supreme Court and the laws of this country have always held that a voice can be silenced if there is a threat to the life of those that the government is entrusted with managing its citizens. So think about an obvious example. Many people today, for instance, may feel that freedom means that if they have an ethical obligation to give an instructional on a Facebook Live recording as to how to build a nuclear bomb and detonate it in the middle of Manhattan, why, who is the government to take away my freedom? Yeah, that's not what the founders were talking about. That's why the Declaration of Independence says life first. That's why freedom of speech has never been unlimited. You do not have the right, because of your personal desire to be free and to have your voice heard, to murder millions of people in a flash.
Exactly.
There it is. All right.
Kenny, you said my verbiage is scrumptious. If I'm coming up with verbiage that's scrumptious, I'm feeling good.
every so often, Scott, somebody will articulate a viewpoint so clearly that I'll literally feel my old viewpoint go into the little trash can, and then I hit erase, and now the new viewpoint is there. So
Well,
you
you've
just did
done
that
that
for
with me
me.
before.
Mm,
As
yeah.
Oliver Wendell Holmes says, and he's a famous judge for those of you who don't know, he once said, "Your freedom ends at the tip of my nose."
Hmm.
Mm.
Your freedom ends at the tip of my
You
nose.
don't have the freedom to punch me.
Yes.
Make no mistake about that.
Man, I feel good. I feel like I learned a lot.
You know, and you literally just broke down what freedom of speech is um based on what you just said because of the life being first. As long as it's not threatening anybody, then yeah, you have freedom of speech. Like that was as clear as you can make it, and it's very in that because that's what I did not get that until you just said it. When people say something violent and say, "Well, it's freedom of speech," it's like, no, that's not what that means, right?
Yeah.
And you just really broke that down of what that means. You don't have freedom of speech if you're looking to harm other people.
Yeah, now there is an imminence there, right? It's one thing if you say, "I want to have a revolution, burn this country down." Now, which by the way, I'm not saying.
Let's just
But
take
if you're
that
just sort
clip.
of talking and it's just words, that you have freedom of speech with regards to. But if it's an imminent threat, I think that that's really where this line is. So that also could be expanded out endlessly. You could be espousing a view. For instance, I don't believe that people should get polio vaccines. You can espouse that. That's not creating an imminent threat to public safety.
Okay, Scott. So to Germany's point, then, if the Nazi movement was very violent, and then they have put in place to silence those and put a severe penalty in place because it was violent to to a group of people, is why do you think some of that rhetoric has not been adopted in the U.S.?
Because
Not
they
not 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 that not that not that specifically, but just like groups of people who have like certain points like those group of people who live here in the US who can do those rallies, or people who don't like certain people of color who can and violently do things like not in Germany. They're like, yeah, if this is what you're trying to do, it's a severe penalty. Why isn't
Because
that adopted in the US?
well, those things have been the subject of litigation around constitutional litigation, are subject of constitutional litigation. And so again, I don't recall all of these cases off the top of my head, so I want to make sure that I qualify what I'm about to say. But it's one thing to say, I don't believe that a particular group, that all of the Scott Masons in the world, I believe that all of the Scott Masons should not have civil liberties, and and have a picture of Scott Mason's head severed and tossing that and showing that to everyone. That's not really threatening me with any harm. That's just hot air. It's another thing to say, while I'm sitting in a movie theater, Scott Mason just set the movie theater on fire, and then there's a stampede and people want to shoot me on the spot. That's a different situation. And so I think that again, the imminency of the harm and the severity of the danger are also what comes into play. If my harm is just an irritant to my fingernail, for instance, if I say, oh, Chris's nail color is ugly, so scratch his fingernail. I don't know that would justify government intervention in the speech. But if I were to say, for instance, and that's why things like inciting violence against the government are a crime. If you are saying, let's go shoot the president right now, and then you don't expect to suffer criminal consequences, that's a different story, especially if that president goes and shot.
So let me ask you something, Scott. And how are we doing on time? Because this might end up.
We've got a few more minutes. This is a great conversation.
Do you agree with the saying that life imitates art?
Sometimes, absolutely.
Okay, sometimes. Good choice of word. So I was just looking at what Melody said in regards to the recent school shootings, and I remember that when I was um, growing up, I was in school during the Columbine shootings,
Mm,
and I wasn't in Columbine, but I was in school when that
yeah.
tragedy occurred, and I remember that there was a lot of publicity surrounding the artist Marilyn Manson, and that his music influenced the children or the kids that committed the Columbine shootings to actually commit these atrocities. And he was sued left and right and had to get into all of these legal battles. But I think that he was able to hide behind, and I still don't really know how I feel about this, to be honest, but this is why I want to bring it up. The fact that I'm an artist. In art, I have the ability to really push the edges of human expression. And I think he was okay by basically saying, as long as it falls within the realm of artistic expression, I'm safe. Comedians have the ability to do that. Comedians can be very racist. And when they're done, they're kind of free from any scrutiny because they're just comics. So if life imitates art and art might be saying certain bad things, then should we be kind of controlling what is said in art?
So generally, there has been a bias in our legal system against penalizing artists for opinions that are unpopular, because that is really, well, first of all, there's also different levels of speech that are protected with different levels of intensity. Political speech is the most intensely protected form of speech. Then commercial speech is far less protected. So the government has the right to regulate commercial speech in a way that it might not be able to regulate political speech. So if the artist is making a political point, it's more difficult for the government to extract a regulatory or criminal or other penalty against that artist, because that speech is political. But secondly, again, it goes as to the imminency. Is that song really causing danger to the public right now in the moment? Probably not. Is there a definite link between a particular dangerous outcome and the song? So Marilyn Manson songs and the shootings that the people had in Columbine, to me, is a difficult thing to prove as a connection, because millions of people listen to Marilyn Manson, and millions of people don't just immediately go out and shoot. I think the story would be different if he put out an album and all of a sudden, for every album that was purchased, a person got shot. Maybe we'd be having a different situation or different thinking about this. But it's hard to even prove the link there.
I'm trying to find.
And then Gloria says, no, Marilyn Manson said something different. And I don't, Gloria, I will be honest, I don't know enough about Marilyn Manson's music to truly answer this. This is really, and you're raising some finesse here, and it's very much appreciated, because those are the general legal principles here in the US that would govern the ability of the government to regulate or punish or otherwise censor his speech.
By the way, I'm a big Marilyn Manson fan. I really like his music. So, Gloria, I'm with you, girl. Antichrist Superstar was a great album, but I think it was a very good example of do you omit art if in some way it had an effect, or in some way it could be shaping the views of an entire group of children or people, for that matter.
The jurisprudential response to that is that the best antidote to hate speech is more speech. However, right, it's called the marketplace of ideas. It's basically a free market approach as to speech, that the quality of speech that is the highest will win. Now, what's controversial is whether that is an overly optimistic view of human nature.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and then also whether we would trust the government to be the enforcer of that, even if it is overly optimistic.
Yeah. I mean, do they enforce that? Or if it's a free market, is there an enforcement component to it?
No, there are only limited situations in which the government can enforce or prohibit speech. Very, very limited circumstances. Again, they're usually related to danger to the country or to an individual.
Yeah.
And
I mean, people have been arguing against racism for a very long time and have brought up many good points to detract people from being racist, but people are still racist. So if the good, reasonable things eventually rise to the top, it's not rising. So
yeah, I mean, those who wrote those decisions and came up with that thinking, I think it would be very interesting to hear what their thoughts were in light of current events. But be that as it may, we're coming to the close of the hour. This has been an incredible discussion. Gloria, it is good to see you here. It's got to be late where you are. So particularly want to thank you for that, for being here, for being engaged, for really putting in thought and being with us here. Melody, it is always good to see you. Controversy gets the most attention. Well, I will admit that's why I started off the hour with my friend's story about cannibalism. Thank you. Melody, you also had the courtesy to mention a clubhouse room that I co-host with Diane DeResta that is on Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time called Confidence, Clarity, and Charisma. Melody actually is kind of an unofficial co-host of that. And so it's great to have you here, and it's great to have you there in the morning. Kenny, it is, again, so good to have you back. We're going to tell you exactly who Brian and Chris are in a minute. I know you asked about that, being fashionably late and all. And it doesn't matter when you're here. What matters is that you're here with us because you're part of our family. Joseph, I'll tell you something. You're a friend of this show. You're a friend for life. We hope you come back over and over again and keep up this quality contribution. You really elevated the discussion. Jessica, I know that a lot of times you're in and out, but that you are here with us, and it is good to have you here as well. Kenny and Joseph, I hope that you both come back and let us know how your new connection with each other goes. And Gloria, in closing, thank you for that link to YouTube. We will look that up because it will get us to have additional thoughts about this conversation. And that sort of engagement, again, is deeply appreciated. Chris and Brian, you are co-hosts of the show now once a month. Tell the folks who you are.
You take it, Chris.
And maybe tell us about your show in particular and where we can find you.
100%. So, Chris Sykes, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just type in Chris Sykes, that should pop up. Brian and I, we have a show called Success Fundamentals where we have very real conversations with successful people from a mind, body, spirits component to kind of give people, get people who are trying to become successes in their own lives, give them actual practical advice and know how to do so by focusing on the fundamentals of who they are. We have very deep conversations. Scott was episode 3, so if you all, he was on twice, and I think this first one was very, very good, and the second one is going to be even more amazing when he comes back. And that's me.
Yeah, it's a case study of success. So Chris and I reflect upon the lessons that we learned from other people, and then we have awesome guests like Scott and many others on the show, and we dive into variety of different subject matters. So we'd love to have you.
We love having you all too. And before we close out, I have to give a shout out to another silent partner in this show, which is our sponsor, Spectrum Designs. Now, for those of you who do not know, anytime you are wearing a nice little t-shirt, some company out there has printed it. And in the United States, there is no better printer of t-shirts and hoodies and other sorts of custom-made apparel for businesses or for individuals than Spectrum Designs. We absolutely love them. But not only that, they are a company that does this for a good cause. Spectrum Designs employs almost exclusively folks that are on the autistic spectrum, hence the name. That community has an almost 90% unemployment rate. But Spectrum not only employs them, but it provides them with real, meaningful jobs. Their CEO, Patrick Bardsley, is an inspiration. They genuinely care about their staff, and they do quality work that stands up with the best factories anywhere. We're going to just tell you a little bit more about them right now.
No way! Look at those shirts. I want one too. Are you alright? I think I'm okay. Okay. Let's show them the t-shirt. Yeah, let's show them